23 accidents, 7 levels. I've compiled some of the most disturbing theme park accidents ever documented. We'll start with some unexpected mishaps and go deeper into gut-wrenching disasters with unforgiving consequences. So, let's start at the tip of this iceberg. Level 1. Towers snapping cable. It was a 25-year-old veteran ride that was too tall to miss, and its adrenaline-pumping appeal was simple. Enjoy high-speed ascents or descents that could reach up to 60 miles per hour, depending on which of the 4 towers you choose. But on August 10th, 2025, at around 8 p.m., this wouldn't be the thrill guests experienced on the Power Tower at Cedar Point Amusement Park. As one of the ride's vehicles launched 100 feet in the air, preparing to be dropped, a loud noise of cables snapping and metal grinding echoed from the tower. People waiting in line ran in panic as a thick metal cable lashed down below like a whip, though the real danger was to those still on top of the now damaged ride, stranded over 100 feet in the air, dangling their feet. Fortunately, the maintenance crew managed to lower the ride's vehicle through the safety system that the park spokesperson described as having worked as designed. Hence, no emergency personnel were needed to evacuate the passengers safely. The Ohio Department of Agriculture immediately placed a stop operation order on the ride, and ever since this incident in August 2025, the ride has been closed for further investigations. The Tipping Pendulum Ride. The ride's called the Magic Carpet, and it can whisk riders 50 feet in the air without ever turning them upside down. However, on July 8th, 2021, instead of just swinging from left to right, the ride also tipped back. And dozens of people who boarded the Magic Carpet at the National Cherry Festival Fair in Michigan were a step away from possibly lethal injuries. Metal scraping sounds began to echo throughout the fairgrounds, and it wasn't until the ride began visibly tilting, revealing that part of its base was coming off the ground, that nearby fair guests realized something was wrong. They immediately stepped in and hung on to the front of the ride to prevent it from tipping backward. Fortunately, by then, the operator had already switched off the ride's power, so it was only a battle against the pendulum's gravity-induced swinging motion, which lasted for about 2 minutes. No one was injured by the Magic Carpet, but riders were visibly shaken by the incident and ran off to hug their loved ones after safely stepping down. Arnold Amusements, the operator of the fair, mentioned that the Magic Carpet ride came off the blocking. And even though no one was injured during the incident, the Magic Carpet was dismantled the very next day and sent back to its manufacturer. In the end, no penalties were imposed on the ride's operator. Reverse bungee cord snaps. It works just like a slingshot, only this time the passengers become the projectiles. 2 cables are attached to each end, and when they're released, the sphere shoots toward the sky. It's one of those few amusement rides where you're not lumped with too many strangers as you shout your lungs out. On August 4th, 2023, reverse bungee was operating normally in Dalian, China, and 2 thrill-seeking passengers strapped in to experience the rush of adrenaline. But seconds after being launched, one of the 2 cords suddenly snapped. People waiting in line scattered and shouted in fear while the 2 passengers dangled sideways several meters off the ground, being held by the remaining cord. The park's crew immediately rushed in, climbed the ride's poles, and worked together to manually lower them to safety. Later, the regulatory team arrived on the scene to inspect the situation, and the park released this statement. A malfunction in the right hanging axle triggered the ride's safety wire rope and safety belt protective function, causing the equipment to halt and the passengers to hang sideways. Authorities confirmed that neither of the 2 passengers was seriously injured, but this still doesn't erase the fact that those 2 are too traumatized for any bungee ride in the future. Or who knows, maybe they loved it. Probably not. Level 2. The People Spilling Carousel. A video of one amusement park ride recently went viral when it showed a carousel simply turning as usual at first, when all of a sudden, one carriage tipped over to the side, spilling its young passengers to the ground. Some managed to land feet first, but others fell on their back, which likely caused severe injuries. But what exactly went wrong? Well, this video is just one of many instances of amusement park rides with no formal or law-mandated maintenance going rogue in India. For many people in the country, such rides are simply part of life. They pop up in temporary fairs, and unfortunately, for operators of these rides, the convenience of assembling and dismantling them is often the priority, not necessarily the safety of its future riders. This incident did not make local headlines, and it's unclear exactly where it occurred or how many were involved. This only suggests one thing. In the country of daredevils, such mishaps are so common that they hardly attract media attention. Stuck upside down. In July of 2023, 8 people were enjoying a county festival in Wisconsin, here in the United States, and they suddenly had one of the worst days of their lives when they hopped on a ride called Fireball. This ride was supposed to circle continuously in a loop until the ride ended. But this time, the train car stopped midway near the top while people hung suspended upside down. Emergency personnel were dispatched to the scene within 15 minutes, but they had no equipment that could bring down the stuck passengers, so they did the only thing possible at the time: check on the passengers hanging upside down. For most people, being in an inverted position for more than several minutes can cause serious symptoms such as dizziness, increased blood pressure, and, worst of all, brain damage leading to coma or death. Those risks can pile up within minutes, yet the rescue process lasted several hours. The nearest truck capable of reaching riders at over 100 feet height was stationed 45 minutes away from the festival. It was immediately dispatched, but that travel time alone was enough to concern medical personnel. 10 fire trucks and 9 ambulances from 3 different counties came rushing in. But for onlooking parents, not being able to do anything but watch became a challenge of its own. The first rider was evacuated by firemen using extended ladders and an aerial platform after hanging for 2 hours. But by the time the last rider had been rescued, it had already been 3.5 hours. Rescued passengers were immediately provided with a full medical evaluation on site. Luckily, no serious injuries were noted, though at one point it seems like an old man in the ride seemed to have passed out prior to being rescued. Separate investigations of how the ride malfunctioned pointed to the same cause. A lighting transformer broke free from its mounting fasteners and was lodged between the carrier track wheel and the electrical box, which caused the train to stop and get stuck. Now, we've gone past the 0 injury threshold, but the stakes are about to get way more painful in the coming levels. So, hit that subscribe button and let's dive in. Level 3. The Ocean Slide. Test your courage on a fear-inducing challenge like nothing you've ever dared, dangling high above the ocean. This is how the Royal Caribbean Icon of the Seas cruise ship advertised its onboard water slide when it launched in 2024. But it became a foreshadowing of the horror a passenger was about to experience on that slide. On August 7, 2025, one passenger bravely dared to ride the frightening Bolt, the record-breaking slide that offered the longest drop at sea, measuring 46 feet. As he descended the slide, a section of the acrylic glass broke. The water gushed out so violently that other guests nearby immediately noticed the problem. Eyewitnesses shouted for the staff to stop operations, and luckily the on-site personnel listened. Had the people below not shouted to stop the ride, It's not hard to imagine that the next person descending could have been much more seriously injured. The cruise line did not mention specifics of the incident and only released this statement. Our team provided medical care to an adult guest when acrylic glass broke off a water slide as the guests passed through the slide. But one passenger reported that the rider's leg and back were cut open pretty badly. The injured passenger, through his attorney, confirmed that they plan to file a lawsuit against the cruise line. However, no further updates about this are currently available. Roller coaster bump. For Holly Core, the El Toro roller coaster at Six Flags Great Adventure has always been a must-ride whenever she was at the park. It's supposed to feel like a bull trying to shake you off. Unfortunately, on multiple occasions, the ride took that theme to the extreme. Just 3 months after it was named the #1 roller coaster of the year by USA Today in August of 2022, riders of El Toro experienced a sudden, violent jolt just before the ride ended.
It almost like it jerked. Everybody on was kind of like, okay, what just happened?
Holly thought the bump wasn't such a big deal, but it was. During that bump, 14 people were injured, sustaining neck, back, and mouth or tongue injuries. 5 adults had to be transported to the hospital for treatment. How the ride malfunctioned was not specified to the public, but inspectors at the time deemed the ride structurally compromised, with damage to the track support columns. Surprisingly, this wasn't even its first incident. Just the year prior, the ride partially derailed, and the state had to fine the amusement park $5,000. Speculations went around that the El Toro might be removed due to its safety concerns, but 10 months after the bump incident, it opened to the public once again. Not the chillest ride. It's one of the most predictable rides you could expect at a county fair. Upon sitting down and being fastened, the Star Flyer slowly lifts you 100 feet in the air and rotates around the tower, almost flying. However, in December of 2024, as the crowd on board the ride was expecting to take in the fair's dazzling lights, it suddenly rotated in the opposite direction. With a sickening sound, it dropped, slamming people violently to the ground and even toward the operator's booth. Videos captured how onlookers initially screamed and panicked, but later rushed to help the victims who could free themselves from the rubble. The fairground was suspended after the accident. What exactly caused the malfunction hasn't been disclosed yet, but the same operator of the fair returned to the grounds 3 months after the incident, enraging victims of the Star Flyer. Ride on fire. On April 7th, 2023, people waiting in line to ride the Objectif Mars and Futurescope theme park were shocked to find that the upcoming car they were supposed to board was on fire. And while this was a horrifying scene for those waiting in line, it was even worse for people actually on the ride. As the ride was ongoing around 10:16 in the morning, a lithium battery installed under the second car caught fire. The disaster happened near the end of the ride as it approached the station, so by the time staff arrived to help passengers escape and extinguish the fire, victims had already been exposed to heat, smoke, and flames for several seconds. Screams echoed in all directions, and the scene wasn't what anyone expected from the park's largest investment. 2 female riders were injured, and one suffering burns to her ear and neck, while another suffered injury to her shin. The ride was closed immediately after the incident and reopened 2 months later after removing the car spinning function and the lithium batteries used for it. Level 4. Biggest parks, biggest fire. When you're in the largest theme park in Germany, surrounded by water activities and excited families, the last thing you'd expect is a huge column of black smoke billowing into the sky. On May 26, 2018, approximately 6:20 p.m., that's the very sight that surprised Europa Park's visitors. Inside a warehouse structure of the Pirates and Batavia attraction, a fire broke out. Initially, the flame was contained indoors, but as it exited through the roof and other openings, a large plume of smoke became immediately apparent. At first, only the adjacent areas were evacuated. Fire alarms blared throughout the park, and all staff mobilized quickly. But the fire grew fast inside the building, filled with combustible materials. Hence, all visitors had to be assisted outside the park. About 250 emergency service workers, including police officers and ambulance crews, were on standby to help with the evacuation process. While the staff focused on getting people to safety, burning embers radiated outward, igniting other areas of the theme park. Though through the efforts of the 250 firefighters, the fire was eventually contained a little past midnight. All 25,000 or so visitors were evacuated swiftly from the park. No evidence linked the fire to foul play, and no guests were injured, so the accident did not require extensive investigation or legal action. However, 7 out of about 250 firefighters responding to the area suffered minor injuries due to smoke inhalation. Derailed beachside roller coaster. It was the definition of a trusted amusement park ride. Over its 43-year lifetime, this roller coaster had been relocated across 6 different amusement parks. This time, it was arguably in its most picturesque location yet, beside Daytona Beach. On June 14, 2018, dozens of people waited in line to ride the Sand Blaster, just like any other day. But then, the unexpected happened. Panic erupted at the amusement park as the first of the 3 roller coaster cars derailed. 2 of the 4 riders in the front car were dumped more than 30 feet to the ground. Worse, those who didn't fall were constantly under the same risk, especially the remaining 2 riders that were still in the front car, holding on in a nearly upside-down position. By that time, other guests in the second and third cars were only partially derailed, but the fear that they could be next in line was still present. Riders screamed for help as witnesses below panicked. It didn't take long for nearby people to rush in and physically hold parts of the derailed car to prevent it from shifting or falling further. However, it took more than 30 minutes for rescuers and medics to safely evacuate the riders using ladders and fire trucks. An independent engineer hired by the state concluded that excessive operating speed was the primary cause of the derailment. Many also noted that the year before the tragedy, the Sandblaster had been temporarily shut down after state inspectors discovered more than a dozen problems, from damaged braces to cracked supports. Despite all these errors, the amusement park continued operating the ride, setting the stage for the disaster that followed. 6 of the 10 riders were hospitalized, including 2 from the front car who were trauma alerts, critically injured and in immediate need of life-saving care. Roller coaster crash. The first wave of passengers has just left the station, and within minutes, the second roller coaster train pulled up and started unloading its existing riders to cater to the next group. But just while everything seemed routine, it wasn't. Unbeknownst to the passengers who were still getting off the second train car, the train that had just left the station failed to clear its first hill, and it was now heading back at full speed. Within seconds, the first train, still filled with 22 riders, slammed directly into the second one, where 9 people still hadn't stepped off. The collision wasn't a simple bump, but a full-on clash with forces so strong that the second train was pushed out of the station. Screams filled the area as injured passengers struggled to move while covered in blood, and some lost consciousness. Right away, the emergency was called in, and about 120 emergency ambulances were dispatched to the scene. 28 people were brought to 3 different hospitals. Of them, 17 had to be hospitalized and 4 had to be admitted to the ICU due to the severity of their injuries, ranging from brain hemorrhage to pelvic fracture. An accident investigation team was assembled from 12 departments of the Shenzhen government, who later revealed that the bolts that should have held the brake fins responsible for slowing down the first train if it ever failed its first hill were loose. Worse, the first one was completely misaligned. So not only did the brake fail to slow down the first train as it reversed, but it also directly contributed to the first train's failed lift. In the end, 9 officials were held accountable for the collision, and the ride was never reinstated again. Snapped in two. The 360 Degrees was one of the most thrilling attractions in the Green Mountain Resort in Saudi Arabia. It was a ride that flung riders like a frisbee as the gondola swayed like a pendulum. As usual, the ride queue filled to the brim on July 31st, 2025. The ride started off normally, with people enjoying themselves and screaming from the thrill. But then, as the arm swung toward its highest point, a sharp metallic crack ran out. In an instant, the connection where the support beam was attached to the central pole snapped. And after its arm bumped into the ride structure, jerking the riders, the gondola was dropped from several dozen feet, slamming more than 20 riders straight to the ground, still harnessed in their seats. The excitement quickly turned into fear as guests scrambled to get out of their harnesses. Emergency services quickly arrived on scene and assisted the injured. Some victims were treated on site, but others had to be transported to hospital care. The government ordered the immediate shutdown of the resort. But for many riders, the damage had already been done. 23 passengers who were on the ride were injured, 3 of whom were in critical condition. Had the gondola landed upside down, the consequences could have been far deadlier, with multiple fatalities likely. Very few details are known about what exactly caused the accident, but the resort remains closed to date. The Smiler Accident. The Smiler. One of its brilliant features was that people in the queue could watch 2 trains appear to duel in perfect synchronization. On June 2, 2015, however, this statement would have a completely different meaning. As a train filled with passengers traveled along the track, it collided with an empty test train that had stalled in the middle of the track, resulting in very devastating injuries for passengers. And the heartbreaking aspect of this tragedy was that the accident was not even caused by an underlying mechanical or technical failure, but rather human error. Unbeknownst to some of the engineering team, a 5th train was added to the circuit to handle large crowds. It was on its test run, so it was empty. Due to undisclosed issues, this empty train failed to complete its circuit. As a result, the ride system shut down the next train's movement while it was hovering on top of the first lift. This was a safety feature that ensured none of the 4 or 5 trains that are simultaneously on the track would ever collide, but engineers, unaware of the newly added 5th train, thought there should be nothing obstructing the track worth concern. Hence, they overrode the safety feature and allowed the packed train to continue, causing the collision. In the crash, 16 passengers were injured. 5 of them, primarily those in the front rows, had life-changing injuries. 2 young women had to be amputated due to the impact of the collision. The men sitting beside them also suffered kneecap and leg fractures that caused long-term disability. Merlin Attractions, the operator of Alton Towers Resort, pleaded guilty to breaching the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act of 1974. They were fined £5 million, and they managed to settle with the victims out of court. Level 5. Most expensive keys. On June 19th, 2024, people sitting in the front row of the Banshee roller coaster pulled up with blood on their faces. This, by itself, was not that concerning. Nosebleeds in intense rides happen, sometimes due to pressure changes or maybe sudden jostling, but what's very uncommon this time was that the people finishing the ride at the station collectively shouted, "We hit something." A rider had blood on his face while two people in the front row had cuts and scrapes. At first, the riders theorized that they might have hit an animal, but it turned out to be the worst-case scenario. As the staff went over to where the riders described the animal was, they found a human body lying on the ground. The ride's personnel immediately recognized him as the man who was frantically asking for his keys earlier. That man was 38-year-old Antonaro Nelson, a guest who had also been on the ride earlier that day. Paramedics quickly transported him to the hospital, but the reason for his demise would become the news headlines. During his time on the roller coaster, Nelson's keys slipped out of his pocket. He frantically approached one of the staff members to see if they could retrieve his keys ASAP, but the crew informed him that he would have to wait until after the park closed for the day to get his keys back. However, Antonaro decided to take matters into his own hands. He illegally entered the ride's restricted fenced area, and unfortunately by doing so, he was hit by the 70-mile-per-hour roller coaster train passing through the track. Nelson was in critical condition for 2 days and unfortunately passed away due to blunt force trauma to the head. The ride was closed for investigation for the entire duration, but was reopened 3 days later after officials confirmed there was no mechanical failure. The hero who fell. The Ride of Steel, a high-thrill roller coaster in Darien Lake Theme Park Resort, wasn't for the faint of heart. But 3 teenagers from Wellsville were up for a challenge. So they hopped onto the ride as usual, not expecting that they were about to witness one of the scariest real-life scenes of their lives. While the train reached the top of the second highest hill, they saw one man in front of them reach for his hat. But then he slipped out of his seat and plummeted about 150 feet straight to the ground. By the time the train returned to the station, the teens and most other riders were screaming, shouting, "Help! Someone fell out!" The staff initially thought they were simply yelling in excitement, smiling and waving, until they noticed one of the passengers was no longer in his seat, even when the restraint bar and seatbelt were still intact. An emergency medical team was called, but after law enforcement, who arrived at the scene first, confirmed that the man was no longer alive, the emergency response was canceled before arrival. The victim was Sergeant James Hackamer, a 29-year-old veteran who had lost his right leg below his knee and his left leg at his hip in a roadside bomb explosion while he was deployed. The Ride of Steel safety rules stated that riders must have 2 legs to board the coaster at both the entrance and exit, as the ride only used a T-lap restraint and seatbelts, which would not secure a rider without legs. However, none of the operators, who were mostly in their early 20s, questioned the sergeant's eligibility to ride. He also managed to bypass the safety height standards, which he wouldn't have met under normal procedures, as he entered through the handicap access lane and not the regular queue. Evidence showed that Sergeant Hackamer passed away instantly due to trauma to his head. His nephew, who was riding directly beside him, was left in shock, unable to move or speak by the time the roller coaster train returned to the station. Level 6. Deadly Octopus Tentacles. On June 20th, 2025, a seemingly friendly-looking octopus ride at Sayajiarajay Water Park in India malfunctioned catastrophically. The ride, which spins and circles riders, seemed like a relatively chill attraction at first. However, as the octopus ride rotated at high speeds, one of its 8 arms snapped off. The detached seats plummeted to the ground, with riders still strapped inside. Everything happened fast, and the fatality count did not lag behind. By the time the victims were transported to a private hospital, Dushar Jamal, a 35-year-old insurance agent, was already pronounced dead due to severe head injuries. His friend suffered a similar trauma. The brother of the deceased filed a formal complaint against the operators, with charges including death by negligence and acts endangering public safety. He claimed that the ride was not maintained and was deliberately turned faster than needed by the staff. Ohio State Fair crash. The Ohio State Fair had just opened, and as most couples did, 18-year-old Tyrell Jarrell and his girlfriend took the opportunity for a fun outing. One of their stops was the Fireball, a fast ride that rotated 360 degrees, with each arm moving on its own orbit. But halfway through the ride, the unthinkable happened. One passenger carriage detached, ejecting passengers from 20 to 30 feet in the air straight to the ground at very high speed. It was the very car that Tyrell and his girlfriend were riding in, and the impact was as strong as that of a high-speed vehicle crash. Amid the screams and panic, some witnesses tried to remove unconscious or weak victims from the site of the crash. Others scrambled to call emergency services, who arrived on the scene within minutes. Victims were assessed on the scene, and those who were injured were transported to nearby hospitals. The U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission later published a document that stated what went wrong with the ride. Apparently, the excessive corrosion on the interior of the gondola support beam dangerously reduced the beam's wall thickness over the years, and this directly caused the malfunction during Tyrell's ride. Unfortunately, Tyrell, who had just recently signed up for the Marines, did not survive the accident. He was declared dead on the scene and was the sole fatality of this incident. 7 more people, including the young man's girlfriend, were injured. Their ages ranged from late teens to early 20s to 50s, and 3 were in critical condition at the time of the incident. No criminal charges were filed against the park, but about $78 million in compensation was awarded to the victims following lawsuits filed against the ride's manufacturer. Forced to their death. They didn't really have a choice. Workers at the Kishkintag amusement park were about to wrap up their night shift, but then management had one last favor: to test the new ride, the Disco Dancer. So, 28 employees hopped on the ride, spinning around and around until the operators could deem it safe enough for guests. But 2 rounds of spinning at full speed later, they started to hear weird noises coming from the motor. They sensed something might have gone wrong, so they screamed their lungs out, trying to get off. But the organizers ignored their pleas, a negligence that would permanently alter many lives for the worse. With the staff fearing for their lives, the 3rd round of the Disco Dancer was still underway, and as it sped up, the capsule fell off, collapsing to the ground. It broke into 3 pieces as victims shouted in pain and for help, but as devastating as the event already was, the park still attempted to cover up the accident at first. Instead of immediately calling in emergency services, they tried to administer on-site first aid to the 28 employees who were mostly injured. But the injuries obviously required professional medical care, so the operators had no choice but to bring some to the hospital. While being transported, a 20-year-old staff member was declared dead. It's unclear whether the additional delay imposed by the cover-up attempt contributed to this unfortunate result. Investigations revealed that the ride, which was flooded 5 months earlier, was not in an operational condition. To make it worse, Zamperla, an Italian manufacturer, later issued a statement that, although the ride looks identical to one of their designs, it was an unauthorized, poorly executed forgery of their creation. Following the accident, police arrested the theme park's manager and owner after local residents and politicians staged protests that blocked nearby roads for justice to be served. Level 7. 6 Flags Fall. The new Texas Giant was one of the best of its kind. Its 79-degree first drop maximized that sensation of negative G-force, the sort of feeling you get when you're lifted out of your seat. But this time, that was the very motion that caused a tragedy. It was just past 6:30 p.m. on July 19, 2013, when 52-year-old Rosa Ayala Gayona Esparza rode the new Texas Giant with her family. She was initially concerned that her safety bar was not fully secured, but the ride's computer stated otherwise. Hence, Esparza, along with multiple other riders in her train, continued on the ride. The ride operated as usual, yet the tragedy occurred almost immediately after the train left the station. Witnesses in the row behind Esparza described how they tried to help her while her feet were up in the air, but were unable to reach her. Her daughter and son-in-law, who were sitting in the row in front of Esparza, unfortunately also witnessed the very moment she was upside down when they turned to look back to see how she was doing. By the time the train reached the first major drop of the roller coaster, Esparza had already been ejected from her seat. Her family panicked, and the ride's operators immediately called emergency services for help. Firefighters searched possible locations where Esparza fell from the roller coaster. Due to the sheer size of the ride, it took them an hour to recover the victim's body. Esparza had been partially wrapped around a support beam and was found lying on top of the roof. Six Flags was sued by Esparza's family but denied every allegation, claiming that the independent contractors were responsible for the passenger restraint system. Scary ride in disguise. In France, Parc Saint-Paul made it possible for anyone to experience the thrill of racing in Formula One through its Formula One coaster. It was a considerably tame ride, much less intense than other attractions in the park, but still thrilling enough to be enjoyed by adults. So, a 32-year-old woman, Elodie D, made the most of this family-friendly attraction. She, her husband, and her sister got to enjoy the ride while her 2-year-old birthday boy was in the care of someone trusted. But by the time the ride ended and was returned to the station, Elodie D was no longer in her seat. During a turn on the roller coaster, the young mother went over the safety rail, plummeting 7 to 8 meters to the ground. At the time, her husband frantically tried to grab her foot, but the speed and momentum of the ride made it impossible to save her. As the ride came to a stop and staff were informed of what had happened, emergency services were called immediately. Unfortunately, however, they were unable to resuscitate the victim on the scene, as a few minutes after falling, Elodie had passed away due to cardiac arrest. Due to her cause of death, varying versions of events emerged as the news broke out. The theme park claims that staff immediately tried to help the victim, and safety checks were considered adequate. But they hinted that she might have had a medical episode on the ride, mentioning that the victim was a heavy-set woman weighing close to 100 kilos. But her sister, Lauriane, who was sitting in the row behind during the ride, challenged this account. She stated, "My sister was sitting normally on the ride and was even holding on," and asked people to respect her memory. Prior to this incident, the ride had a history of safety concerns. In 2005, it had a brake failure, and in 2008, a 35-year-old woman was also thrown off the roller coaster. The park owner at the time was charged and convicted of involuntary homicide after the 2020 incident. The park has announced that the ride will be dismantled and destroyed. Her seatbelt failed her. They had just finished enjoying the water attractions in the park, but as the night crept in, It felt like the perfect time to head on more thrilling rides. So, Priyanka, a 24-year-old woman, and her fiancé headed straight to the roller coaster at Fun and Food Water and Amusement Park. She and her fiancé were seated next to each other, and everything was going exactly as expected up until the ride actually started. Priyanka's fiancé had his eyes closed at the time due to the initial thrill and anticipation of the ride, but as he opened his eyes, Priyanka was no longer beside him. People inside the ride were panicking and screaming. As the roller coaster came to a stop, the fiancé rushed down to find Priyanka and assisted her to the ambulance. By then, she had lacerations on her right leg, puncture wounds on her left arm, and multiple abrasions on her right forearm and left knee. By the time the team reached the hospital, however, Priyanka was declared dead on arrival. Investigations revealed that the ride had a malfunctioning seatbelt, and the victim's fiancé stated that the staff did not double-check the restraints prior to the ride starting. Formal charges have been filed against the park and the staff who were accountable. However, no updates on the case have been publicized. Raging River Death. They had the perfect number to enjoy the raging river to the fullest. Each raft of theirs could hold 6 individuals, and it just so happened that Sabrina Jaramillo was with her husband, 3 sons, and their niece while they were at Adventureland on July 3rd, 2021. As hundreds of people had already done before them, the family took designated spots in the raft, and then the fun began. But something immediately felt wrong with the raft as the rapids carried them away. During the ride, the raft kept bumping against concrete walls and into the large rocks. At times, their feet would also feel the bottom of the ride's track, even when the raft was supposed to be floating. The kids may have missed these warning signs, but the parents noticed, though there was little that could be done at the time beyond trusting the seatbelts on the raft. At first, this turbulence seemed manageable, up until the raft they were on completely flipped over. Instantly, the very seatbelts that should have kept them safe were now threatening their lives. As they found themselves trapped under the raft in an upside-down position, the family struggled to free themselves from the ties that bound them to the 800-kilogram raft. The parents eventually managed to free themselves, but the last thing the father recalled seeing underwater was the silhouettes of their sons trying to grab him and each other in panic. Shortly after, one of their 3 sons and their niece also managed to free themselves. But David Jr., the 15-year-old son, and Michael, the 11-year-old son, were still trapped. With the river too intense to swim against, all the family could do was scream for help. First responders and nearby witnesses jumped in to attempt to rescue. Unfortunately, however, by the time the 2 were brought to the hospital, they had already been without oxygen for too long. David remained in a medically induced coma in critical condition, and when he first regained consciousness, he could not see or talk. He needed to relearn how to speak, eat solid food, and walk from scratch. Michael, the younger of the 2, did not survive. He was pronounced dead the next day after the accident. The raft had passed its annual inspection just the day before the accident with no major issues found, but investigation after the tragedy revealed that a myriad of errors were present in the ride, ranging from undertrained workers to unauthorized modifications of the raft and waterways. The park reached a settlement with the victims 3 years after the accident. The raging river never reopened after the tragedy. Most of these were avoidable accidents. But what happens when tragedy hides in plain sight? Find out in our video on photos with the most disturbing backstories.